On November 20th, 2021, I uploaded the first Even Heroes Die devlog to the channel. It is now officially 2022, which means I've been making these devlogs for a little bit more than a year. Hello everyone, Happy New Year, and today we'll be looking at the progress we've made over the past year, as well as some of the lessons that I've learned. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Even Heroes Die was born from a desire to combine the exploration and power-up progression of a Metroidvania with a procedurally generated world. Your character is afflicted with a deadly curse, so you'll need to extend your life by taking various cures with adverse side effects, or risk an apparition of death coming after you. Prior to 2020, Even Heroes Die had been a project that I worked on here and there in my spare time. There was no real structure to when I worked on it or for how long, and thanks to the naive optimism of being a first-time game developer, I had a ton of ideas that I was eager to build. Now, if you combine these two things, you have a recipe for a game that will never get done. And so that brings me to perhaps my most important lesson, both in game dev and maybe even life. If you want to finish a large project, you need to have goals and need to work towards them consistently. It's great if you can work on your game for hours on end every day, but for me and most people, that isn't an option. So instead, I work on Even Heroes Die every single day, even if it's just for 5 minutes. This helped me build momentum. Whenever I would take a break for a few days, I would completely forget what I was working on, and I would waste time just getting back into my workflow. By keeping this momentum up, I was able to sit down every day and know exactly what I was working on. 6 to 8 months of consistent daily work later, I was able to release the game's first devlog. This was mostly just a video talking about my design philosophy and what my goals were for the game. To me, the next natural step was to release a demo, so I could get some feedback on how the game felt to play. So to do that, I immediately got to work on getting the game into a more playable state. And this was my second lesson. Always keep your game in a playable state. Obviously, this isn't always going to be possible, especially when you're just starting and there's literally no game to play. But you should always try to prioritize your work around creating that core gameplay loop. It's often called a vertical slice. If you think of a sandwich, you take a thin vertical slice, you get a small bit of every part of that sandwich. This is opposed to spending way too much time on one single ingredient of the sandwich. You know, maybe you have some honey smoked ham. Now, lucky for me, I wasn't too far off from that goal, but I did get a little too distracted. As an example, I decided that the game needed to have a menu before I could release the demo. Now, a main menu is fine and certainly important, but it's a great example of something that isn't really a key part of what makes my game my game. I don't even think most people have used it, aside from just pressing start. You can remap the controls, change the resolution, and while I'm glad I got that part of the project out of the way, it's definitely something that I could have waited until the end to do. So January came, I released the demo, and the main thing I wanted to see was, does this game feel fun to play? Does the character control well? And even though content was severely lacking, the demo offered a small taste of exploring procedurally generated levels with Metroidvania-esque roadblocks. You could explore 2 different areas and find a new random power-up in each, allowing you to proceed further until you ultimately reached an empty boss room. And the feedback I got was surprisingly positive. A lot of people liked the idea, and I got some great constructive criticism. A few people mentioned the game's visuals, things like not being able to see the player or enemies, or the forest background colors being way too bright. Someone mentioned that the melee attack hitboxes felt a little off, and it turns out there was a huge bug causing attacks to only last a single frame. Yeah, good luck with your 1/60th of a second window to hit something. One fundamental issue was that the player had too many movement options to start off with. This made other upgrades less important, because you could practically navigate anywhere right off the bat. It's really important to be able to catch these things early on, and for that, I recommend having other people play your game as soon as possible. You don't have to do it like me and release a demo on itch.io and make a big deal out of it, but maybe let a friend play it. It's easy to get this sort of tunnel vision while you develop, and you start to miss these things that other players wouldn't, like for example having default keyboard controls that are terrible. Moving forward from the demo, I got to work on overhauling some of the game's visuals, as well as implementing other suggestions. My pixel art started to follow a more standard palette, and the game became much easier to see. And from there, the world of Even Heroes Die started to grow. I got to work on creating more than just the 3 basic enemies, branching out to 5 distinct enemies per area. Up until this point, the world was devoid of any safe places or people to interact with. So the game got a spark of much needed life when I added a small hub for you to start off in, as well as some NPCs to interact with. There's just something comforting about having a safe, familiar place to return to after you die. And visually, I think it's my favorite area that I've designed so far. You can shop for vials, or take advantage of the game's time system by resting at the inn, or lending the blacksmith your weapon so he can upgrade it. These NPCs trade your in-game time for something valuable, like healing your character or increasing your attack power. I also started working on a new path that would branch from the hub world, containing a snowy mountain area and a water dungeon, so whenever you started a run, you'll spawn in this new hub world, and you can choose to go right to the forest area or left to the mountain area, depending on your preferences. Around the summertime, I stopped creating new areas to focus on adding some polish to the game. Up to this point, I had mostly neglected adding little effects like dust clouds, or the squishing and squashing of enemies when they get hit, or the player when he jumps and lands. Most importantly, I completely overlooked adding sound. I think my next biggest lesson was just how important sound design is to a game, as well as how time consuming it can be. I think I spent the better part of a month hunting down the right sound effects for each possible action the player can do. Don't let it slow down your prototyping process, but once you have something you can start showing to people, I'd say you should look into adding some sound right away. There are tons of resources online like itch.io or freesounds.com. You can get started with these and then replace individual sounds later on. Not only will you save yourself some future headaches, but you'll be surprised at just how much better it makes your game feel. Sound designers, you guys deserve way more appreciation than you get. Along with this phase of adding polish and sound effects, I started to think about other basic game mechanics that could be refined. One of the core mechanics is this curse meter in the bottom left. It'll steadily fill up over time, and you'll want to prevent this by consuming various vials. These vials will come with their own side effects, like decreasing your health or increasing the speed of enemy projectiles. To consume a vial, you needed to pause the game and choose which one to drink. So I decided to separate the vials into their own limited number of slots, forcing you to better manage your resources and allowing you to use them on the fly without needing to pause. Another element that I've thought a lot about is fast travel. Each area will feature multiple paths and treasures that you can return for later after finding new abilities. Since backtracking to power up is a key part of the game, it's important for players to be able to get around without too much of a hassle. Initially, I had this system where you could create your own fast travel points, and you had a limited number of them that could be refilled by killing enemies. I went back and simplified it to instead add to your curse meter each time you fast traveled, so you wouldn't need an extra bar to manage. And now I'm strongly considering simplifying it even further by making fast travel free, instead of making the player create warp points, adding the warp points procedurally. It's a little less creative this way, but you know what? Creativity is overrated. I'm finding that it's important not to get too attached to your own ideas. Just because an idea is creative, or you're proud of it, doesn't mean it's good. Sometimes you'll find that these ideas don't work in practice, and that's okay. It's okay to scrap things, even if you spent precious time on them. In the case of fast travel, I think this whole complicated system that I created doesn't add anything fun to the game. It just makes getting around too complicated. It's unintuitive, and I often found even myself forgetting to set warp points, and being frustrated about it later on. So that's that. Until I decide to change it again. I rounded out the year by working on one more area, the mountain dungeon area. With this, there were now 4 distinct areas to explore on 2 different paths, and this dungeon's unique mechanic was water. I pushed the game's procedural generation to its limits by adding switches that could change the dungeon's water level. Level variety is important for roguelites, and while I can try to crank out as many level templates as possible, it's not the only way to accomplish this. I'm aiming to generate variety by layering different forms of complexity on top of each other. Things like having some areas be really dark and require a light source to navigate, or by procedurally adding area-specific mechanics to the rooms, like these vines and crumbly platforms, or how the snow area requires you to jump into these hot springs to stay warm, or how the forest dungeon has these massive gusts of wind that push everything toward the ceiling. The changing water levels of the mountain dungeon are just another way for me to accomplish this. So for the final tally, let's look at what we've accomplished for this year. We now have a hub, 2 overworld areas, and 2 dungeon areas. There's also another set of areas that I've been hard at work on. There are now NPCs and dialogue, as well as the foundation for adding timing-based side quests. We've gone from 3 enemies and a handful of power-ups to over 20 enemies and more than 20 power-ups. I'm happy to say that I've laid most of the groundwork for the game. In 2022, I need to build on this foundation by adding more of, well, everything. I'll start by finishing these 2 new areas that I'm working on, and then I'll add more enemies, power-ups, vials, level templates, and side quests. I'll also need to start working on a couple of boss fights to encounter at the end of each dungeon. And lastly, I'll need to add more in terms of the game's story. A lot of it has been planned, but very little of it has made it into the actual game so far. It's gonna be an incredibly busy year, but if I can accomplish all of these things, I can hopefully start focusing on a final round of testing and polish at the beginning of 2023. Before I go, I just wanted to say thank you all for supporting the channel and this project over the past year. It really means a lot to me when I read your comments and see how excited you guys get about the game. I'm really happy with the amount of growth that we've seen in 2021, and I hope in 2022 we can attract even more people to the channel. So with that being said, please like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you'd like to stay tuned for more updates on the project. Thanks again for watching, Happy New Year, and I'll see you all again soon.